to knock your thing right
During which point, you can begin taking notes for those of you here. As a report. Hey, on Monday, the University Writing Program is handing out $225 cash to students during our second annual Poetry Slam and Slam Pub from 7 to 9 p.m. And I will tell you, the woman who won first place, $100 last year, she was just eating dinner at Sidelines Pub, heard a couple of the first poems, jotted something down, stood up, read it with great vigor, won $100. So show up Monday, whether you're a poet or not, or if you've been to a slam or not, it should be a fun event, and you can walk away a little wealthier. I'm Professor Daniels. I teach in the University Writing Program along with your professor. This is the last of our 6-part faculty lecture series. We've invited faculty from all sorts of disciplines across campus to talk to you this quarter about the kinds of research and writing practices they do in their field. Recognizing that this is what we're teaching in an abstract way in our classes, but to hear someone sort of corroborate what we're saying in our classrooms has been helpful for us, and I hope it's been helpful for you. Tonight's panel is focused on qualitative research methods, not quantitative, qualitative. Qualitative research asks us to close up our books, to temporarily put away our novel about that fictional drag queen or the fictional Vietnam vet, and to spend our time looking at actual drag queens and actual Vietnam vets. Through observations, case studies, and in-depth interviews, qualitative researchers turn our attention away from representations of people and onto the actual people in the places where they live or work or spend their money, and to the rituals, both private and public, that they perform, and to the ceremonies that they hold dear. In part, this interest in actual people within their actual surroundings stems from an understanding that textual representations of people and of their histories are almost always distorted by the author's hand, whether that hand holds a paintbrush or a pen. And also from the belief that such distortions can carry with them the erroneous myths and stereotypes, the flawed reduction of human experience in all of its messy breadth and depth to a certain type or demographic. What we refer to in literary studies as the bad guy, or the angel whore, or the token minority, or that one gay guy in that one movie you remember in that time, or even perhaps better for our purposes, quote unquote, the student who can't use a comma to save her life. I've read about this student in a lot of quantitative studies. Through standardized tests and numerical data, a lot has been argued about that student who can't use a comma to save her life. Legislation has been passed because of her. Funds have been withheld from school systems because of her. Because she, whoever she may be, has come to represent in the minds of legislators and political pundits an entire mass of hers and hens. But by spending a little time with her, and I say this as someone who has dedicated his career to spending time with her, we learn that she's actually quite brilliant and sad, and that she's trying, and she's full of new ideas, and full of a very human kind of terror and sometimes joy. And that her comma usage, represented on paper as okay, not very standard or good, means little in comparison to how she actually learns and what she offers, how she responds to knowledge, how she holds herself quietly as she absorbs what her colleagues tell her, how she goes about generating new ideas of her own. These attributes, the more nuanced and the less verifiable, can only be gotten at through direct observation. They can't be easily measured. And so qualitative research hopes to restore the value of the particular. Tonight, we're fortunate to be hearing from three professors here at DU who approach the topic of qualitative research from widely different perspectives. From the world of medical practices, which has long depended on qualitative measures for diagnosing patients. Wouldn't you rather have your doctor ask you how you're feeling and listen to your response rather than, say, read a novel about you and prescribe medicine that way? So we've got someone talking about medical discourse today. We've got a professor speaking from the world of business and marketing, where an emphasis upon case studies, focus groups, and first-hand observation has come to supplement traditional modes of demographic surveys. And perhaps most traditionally, we have a professor from the world of anthropology, where researchers have long used qualitative measures in the form of field work, even as they have wrestled with the ethical dilemmas that qualitative research entails, such as the role and positionality of the observer. Dean Seda is a professor of anthropology. Professor Seda teaches courses in archaeology, evolutionary anthropology, and material culture. He is co-director of DU's Urban Studies program, serves on the faculty committee of the university's International Center for Civic Engagement, and periodically directs the London Study Abroad program. He is currently co-director of the Colorado Coalfield War Archaeological Project. His research interests are in North American archaeology, labor history, comparative architectural and urban form, and memory and monumentality. Please welcome Professor Seda.
Well, thanks very much. And I promise I will be brief because I really didn't know what was expected of me. I mean, I know the kind of research I do. I haven't really thought that much about writing. I don't think that much about writing. I just kind of do it, but I know that's not helpful to you, right? I mean, you're spending a year learning about writing, so I may need you during the question and answer period to sort of prompt me with questions about what it is that I do. And I should say right off the bat that I'm the person who's probably going to throw a monkey wrench into things because I don't really deal that much with living people. An archaeologist deals with dead people and dead things, and we try to bring the past to life. I think there's an element of qualitative research involved with that, but as I'll explain in a minute, if you're a scholar like me, you have to use every technique, every method, every approach, every strategy, every scrap of evidence that's available to try to say something meaningful about the past. Yeah? So I've got some notes, just some high points that I want to hit you with that will hopefully put into perspective the kind of research and the kind of writing that an anthropologist does. You should know that anthropology is the study of human biological and cultural variation across all time and all space. To me, it is truly the noblest of all the disciplines. There is nothing that escapes the attention or the interest of anthropology. We do it all. And we bring in the humanities, we bring in the natural sciences, we bring in the social sciences, we bring in the arts in an effort to try to understand the human condition. Anthropology has been described as the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the sciences. It's been described as an experimental science in search of laws and an interpretive science in search of meaning. So it's a big tent. It's a really big tent in terms of accommodating different approaches to research and writing. There's nothing even that's really typical about how anthropologists approach research and writing, although over the history of the discipline, there have been moments when there has been a central tendency. There's been one kind of approach that's been emphasized. Either an objectivist approach that you might find in the natural sciences where you sit down and measure things, or an interpretive approach where you cozy up to your subjects, you cozy up to people, and you talk to them and you try to understand what makes them tick. Kind of a warm and fuzzy anthropology. But at any given time, all of that stuff is going on. All of those approaches and all of those strategies are being used. So I read the blurb for the Writing 1133 course, and it said that you were being introduced to a variety of academic research traditions. Text-based research, interpretive research that deals with art and artifacts, quantitative research that's measurement-based, and qualitative research that's based on observation. Yeah? We do all of that. And then again, as an archaeologist, I have to use all of those methodologies, all of those approaches, if I'm going to understand what the past was like. Every day, on a daily basis, I triangulate, if you will, between historical documents, material artifacts, oral traditions, the non-verbal or the non-written accounts that native peoples transmit from one generation to another. And I also measure stuff. I go out in the real world and behave like a scientist. I'm really interested in space. I'm interested in how space is used by people and how people organize settlements and villages. So I do a lot of measuring of house size and house form and the distance between houses and the distance between settlements. So all of these methodologies, all of these research traditions sort of come together in anthropology. Today the field is interesting, though, because we have to find some way to engage with at least two groups of people that historically haven't always been on anthropology's radar screen. One of those groups is native peoples themselves, indigenous peoples, Indians. Yeah? Indians of North America, Indians of the South Pacific, any tribal or indigenous group. For a long time in anthropology, we have treated them as objects, as laboratory specimens. And again, at certain points in the discipline, when we were suffering from what's called physics envy, we tried to make ourselves scientific by just observing natives and measuring the output of their activity instead of talking to them, objectifying them, right? Treating them as lab specimens. You can't get away with that anymore. And I don't know if you've been exposed in your writing courses or any other courses to the so-called post-colonial critique. The post-colonial critique that happened in the 1980s and 1990s sort of threw anthropology into a tizzy, because this is where the natives got militant, they got activist, they resented the presence of the anthropologist or the archaeologist in their community. They asked, what's in it for us? You guys build careers off of studying us, but you don't give anything back to the native community. You treat us like lab subjects. So we had to get hip to that fact that the Indians were on the warpath. They wanted to know what the science of anthropology could return to them. So a lot of research and writing in anthropology these days is aimed at trying to partner with native peoples, with indigenous peoples. We try to bring them on board. We study their oral traditions. We even work at writing with them. And sometimes they write in a really different way. They don't think and write linearly, like those of us in the West do. They approach the act of writing in a rather more indirect and circuitous way. So it's often a challenge to write with native peoples. And I've done a little bit of that. You have to negotiate between the Western way of representing the world and the so-called tribal way of representing the world. And it's a pain in the ass, and it drives you crazy, and it's frustrating as all hell, but you gotta do it. There's still some kicking and screaming, right? There's still some more objectively oriented anthropologists who feel like you betray science if you work with your subject. But I think by and large, the discipline is in a place where it understands you have to work with the people that you are studying. Okay? So that's one group that anthropology is having to pay attention to. The other group is the general public. We have been terrible at writing for the general public. Even though everybody's favorite anthropologist, a woman named Margaret Mead. If there's one anthropologist you've probably heard about in your life, it's Margaret Mead, who studied tribal people of the South Pacific back in the 1920s and 1930s, and alerted Americans to how different the sex lives of savages were. Margaret Mead was a pioneer in writing for the public. She built her career on writing for the public. But in the 1950s and 1960s, the field got away from that because the rhetoric, the language of science was in the air, right? We wanted to make a more scientific discipline in the 1960s. So we forgot about reaching out to the public. Today, thankfully, we're discovering that we have to start writing for the public because politicians and pundits and clerics and the Pope don't know jack shit about culture. Yet they act as if they're experts in the study of culture, and we've got all sorts of people out there making assertions about what culture is like and how culture changes and why cultures vary. But they really don't know what they're talking about. They make all sorts of flawed assumptions about the nature of culture. And you can see this in the work of people like Samuel Huntington, who wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations, which was predicting a global conflict between the West and the rest, including Islam. You can see a manhandling of culture in the work of someone like Thomas Friedman, who writes for the New York Times and has written a very popular book called The World is Flat, which is sort of a manifesto for globalization. These people, again, make all sorts of flawed assumptions about what culture is like and what ethnicity is like. And we're pulling our hair out in anthropology because it's bad ideas about the nature of culture. So finally, we're starting to re-engage with the public. We're starting to write books and op-ed articles and making movies and getting into that game of popular culture because the challenge is there, right? We need to try to set the record straight in terms of what culture is, why it changes, how it works, and what the future is going to be like as we globalize, as the world changes and shrinks. So that's the challenge today for researching and writing in anthropology. Yeah? Engaging with our subjects and then engaging with the general public. So there's a lot of experimentation in anthropology these days. We aren't just writing the standard sort of scientific book or article, but we're experimenting with novels, we're experimenting with autobiographies, where the anthropologist sort of makes themselves part of the study of culture. We're experimenting with, as I mentioned, co-authored books and articles with native peoples. There's a whole exploding area of anthropology called indigenous anthropology. We're finally starting to graduate PhDs who are native people in the field of anthropology. And they're getting into the act by developing these whole new sub-areas of anthropology that are written by and for indigenous people. So it's an exciting time in anthropology because of this experimentation with alternative ways of researching and writing. So what do I do in my practice? I had to think about this for this little presentation tonight. I try not to worry too much about the difference between different kinds of audiences, although I'm assuming that one of the things you learn in first year English and writing is to attend to your audience.
We try to bring that up, yeah.
And so I probably shouldn't confess that I don't care what the audience says. I try to find some sort of common thread that can connect my interest in engaging with other academics, with other scholars, with the general public, and with these indigenous peoples, with the descendant communities of native peoples. I just wrote a book on some archaeological research that I'm doing in southern Colorado that consciously strive to find that balance between writing for scholars, writing for Joe Blow on the street, and writing for indigenous peoples. And so far, so good. The reviews have been good. Right? The book is getting used in college classes, and I hear it's selling well to the general public. But I think the default setting should be consider your audience before you put pen to paper, right? That would probably be the safest way to go. But I'm getting old. I'm in the twilight of my career. I don't have time to worry about audience, right? I want to write for as many people as I can reach simultaneously. I think of my work as being both explanatory and emancipatory. Explanatory in that traditional scientific sense of producing more or less objective knowledge about the world, about what the past was like. But like I say, I'm getting old, I'm getting cranky, I want anthropology to be relevant, so I also adopt this interest in emancipation, in writing stuff that will cause people to reflect on the circumstances of their life, and think critically about the circumstances of their lives, and wonder to themselves if there isn't a better way of living, if there isn't a better way of doing. That's what I mean by emancipation. And archaeologists study this huge span of time called the ancient world, where I think people did things differently and conceivably better than how we do things today. So I try to weave that into my work. It's a twofold project. Again, explanation and emancipation. I try, putting that differently, I try to occupy what some anthropologists have called a militant middle ground between empirical scholarship and then something we call reflexive critique, which is the self-reflection on the circumstances of our lives. Yeah? So this is different from the straight sort of scientific approach, where you just provide the facts and the explanation and the interpretation. It's an activist approach. You're trying to get people to reflect on what this knowledge of the ancient world means for them and means for our ways of living. I tell stories. I adopt a narrative mode. I don't have time for hypothesis testing, even though I have colleagues in the anthropology department who are very keen on adopting that scientific approach, where you lay out a number of hypotheses and you try to test them against the real world evidence. I don't have time for that. Again, I'm old, I'm getting cranky, I'm close to death in a lot of ways. So I want to just tell a story. I want to produce a narrative and construct a knowledge that I think is faithful to the data, but also moves the conversation along that we're having in this society about what culture is, about why cultures vary, and about what it means to live in a good culture, in a good society. So I'm very, again, militant and activist in that research approach, and the narrative style sort of dovetails with that interest. I try to write in plain English, right? Try to avoid a lot of the science speak, but at the same time, I think jargon is important. Words are important, right? I think we should always distrust people who say, write plainly or write commonsensically. Sometimes common sense language can misrepresent what the world is like. So I try to be judicious in my use of jargon. I think some words, again, are important. I try to avoid descriptions of society that are mechanistic, that use sort of systems language. Instead, I'm keener on language that's warmer, fuzzier, kinder, gentler, tries to get at human relations. Yeah? And I could say more about that, but I won't, right? I will spare you the discussion of jargon and a jargon-wise approach in anthropology. But I do think it's important to make the point that words are important. Particular kinds of jargon are important because they capture different things about the world and different aspects of reality. And the last thing I do that I think is liberating for this approach to research and writing in anthropology is trust the conversation, meaning there is never going to be any shortage of people willing to critique your stuff if you're an academic or a scholar. This is why I don't waste my time trying to test multiple hypotheses to find the right one that fits with the data. I got an idea in my head about what's supportable. I wrap it up in a narrative. I tell a story. I'm activist about it. I'm militant about it. I'm looking to move the conversation. I'm looking to move the ball in terms of how we think about culture. And then I leave it up to the scientific community to take their best shots. Yeah? And it's out of that conversation, it's out of that critique that I think comes enlightenment. Yeah? So that, in a nutshell, hopefully that goes to something of what you wanted in terms of how an anthropologist researches the world and writes about the world. I don't think it's typical. I think I'm a bit on the fringe, so you might not be getting the central tendency of anthropology and archaeology today. But most of the good action happens out there on the edge, happens out there on the periphery. That's where change in society is produced. So I'm happy to be on the fringe. And hopefully at some point in your life, you too will occupy that wonderful space that's known as the fringe. So thanks very much.
In many ways, what Dean said is perfect because, in my classes we do 2 weeks of quantitative, and then 2 weeks of interpretive, and then 2 weeks of qualitative. And my savviest students recognize soon, hey, Professor Daniels, this stuff isn't all discrete. We mix and match, and we probably should mix and match. So bringing up that notion of a mixed methodology is very wise. 2 years ago, I had a student tell me, I don't need to learn how to write. I'm a business major. I don't need to know how to do research. I'm getting into accounting. So I brought a professional accountant to my class to teach students, illustrate to them the amount of research and writing that actually goes on in the business school. So I'm very delighted we have a professor of marketing here, Teresa Conley. Professor Conley has professional corporate experience as a marketing consultant for a variety of businesses. Her consulting practice focuses on product development, consumer segmentation analysis, branding, and positioning. And in 2000, she was a Women in Cable and Telecommunications Woman of the Year Walk of Fame recipient. Please welcome Professor Conley.
So welcome everybody. Thank you, David. What a nice introduction. It's an honor for me to be here today. And I thought I'd start out by asking a question. And this is just so I can get your attention on what I'm going to say. Got lots of laptops up. And I'm really curious, how many of you feel as though you're a gifted writer? okay? I'm seeing a few hands. Okay, and some of you may be kind of putting your hand up. The reason why I asked this, okay, a few more. The reason why I asked this, and for the rest of you who didn't naturally put your hand up, you're going to relate to what I'm going to talk about today, I think, in an important way. I'm not a gifted writer, okay? Today I'm a better writer than I was a few years ago, but I can tell you one thing from the bottom of my heart. It's something I really, really work on. All right? When I was in school, my path to business is a little atypical. I actually have a BFA in graphic design. I have a minor in art history. But I naturally segued into the business world and marketing early on in my career. And what I found out in graduate school, like somebody hit me over the head with a rock, is that I didn't know how to write very well. Okay? I wasn't tested on it. I didn't understand the rigor of it. I didn't understand the grammar of it. Nor did I think it was necessarily important for my success. I felt like I've got all these other things going on. I'm curious, I'm interested, I'm passionate. Okay, and in graduate school I learned that, okay, I'm not such a great writer, and my professors pointed it out to me. Okay, before that it wasn't anything that I really needed to do really great, because I was really great at other things. Okay, but once I entered into the world of business, okay, that became really evident. And as I progressed, I was out in corporate America for about 15 years. And what I did after graduate school is I made sure that I did a better job with writing. Okay, I got books, okay? And when I started to do correspondence in the business place, I found out very quickly that if I wrote in a clear and succinct and meaningful manner, okay, my credibility would go up immediately. And sometimes in business, you're taking very complicated ideas and specifications from engineers, and you're putting together 3 PowerPoint slides to represent those concepts. Every single word is important. Your word choice is important. So I had a deficit, and I worked really, really hard to better that. And I eventually found I'm not necessarily great at academic writing, although I do a lot of that. I spend a lot of time writing these days, which is odd. But I'm pretty gifted at copywriting. All right? In business, okay, a lot of what is written, especially in the world of marketing and advertising, has to do with writing copy. All right, now I'll tell you a really quick story. A good friend of mine, you guys know that Chipotle was started around here, right? Okay, a really good friend of mine. Does anybody know William Espy? Okay, William Espy is the head marketing dude at Chipotle. And if you ever read one of their menus or drive by their billboards, that is William Espy's voice. He's a marketing person, but he's written every word for every piece of communication that they have. And the word choices that he uses and the brand characteristics that embody that is what made Chipotle what it is today. It has a brand characteristic and a personality that you can understand because you're a consumer. Whether you eat burritos or not, you have a recognizable understanding of Chipotle. On William Espy's business card, it says irreverent marketing dude. And he is. And if you read those menus and you take a look at that next time you're there, you will hear his voice. Okay, a regular menu, very different than the words that he chooses to use in a marketing context. Okay, the words that you use in marketing help build a picture and illustrate what it is that you're talking about. All right, so we heard about anthropology, and I would agree, it's a very honorable space. One that I won't even touch. I mean, I'm in awe. But I will tell you that marketing, I'm going to one-up you on that. Because my opinion is marketing is the center universe. All right? And part of that is because in marketing and in business, no matter what degree you're getting or no matter what path your life takes, you will find that it has some aspect of business and marketing in it. All right? The University of Denver is a private institution. It is a business. Okay? Every place that you will go, whether you teach or become an anthropology professor or anything, has to do with business. And when it has to do with business, you have to choose your words right, and you have to communicate clearly. And I tell you, it's so, so important. All right, so I wasn't a gifted writer to start with, but I want to segue into qualitative research a little bit. I had the opportunity for years and years and years to do qualitative research in new product development. And in the mid-1995 era, and that was a while ago, I know, for you guys. But what I was doing is working on a business case for a brand new technology. Okay, the first technology of its kind. At that time, people got on the internet, instead of wireless, okay, with a little card in their laptop, they got on the internet how? How did people get on the internet when it first came to be? Dial-up. All right, so everybody was getting a little tired of dial-up, and I worked in an internet startup company called At Home, and I was developing a product which was high-speed internet over cable. Now, in order to make high-speed internet work over cable lines, we had to do a lot of upgrade to the plants and facilities that carry those signals. Because from that point before, okay, those cable plants were delivering messages one way to your TV. And so what we had to figure out with the engineers and everybody in the company is how do we get that signal to go both ways? Because only if we can figure that out can we then be able to send messages and use those huge, magnificent megabit, okay, pipes that are in the ground to send data back and forth. All right, it was a brilliant idea, okay? And so I was vice president of marketing at this company, and we worked with the engineers, we developed a product. And I can tell you, through focus groups and market testing and lots of failures, in 1996 in Fremont, California, we launched high-speed internet over cable, and I had a brand new baby, and I'll never forget the moment, you know, because it was very anxiety-ridden, because we didn't know if it was going to succeed. We had research that told us that there was pent-up demand for fast internet services, but we didn't know how things were going to go, right? And I'll never forget it, because we literally had the cable company starting to install people with high-speed internet in neighborhoods, and we had cars lined up following the cable truck to sign up. Unbelievable success. Now, some of you may get your internet this way now, I don't know, but that was the first launch of high-speed internet. And I can tell you the research and qualitative data that went in there. At one point, I did observational research in some of the homes where we were market testing. And we would literally visit and we would try to be like flies on the wall to do real observational research from an anthropological perspective to see how are they reacting. Do they understand how the remotes, and do they understand how, you know, the cable modem is supposed to work and which lights are supposed to be blinking? And it was such a disaster at one point in time. The one family I'll never forget was like, take your cable modem and get out of our house. All right, so it was really distressing. But when you are involved with research with the business, there's a lot of risk involved. We had a lot of money that our company was giving us to figure this out. And so one of the things that we were able to do is fix some of those problems, not perfectly, but we fixed them enough to launch the product, and then behind the scenes kept fixing, okay, for it to get to be a product that it is today. All right, now after we launched that, I got to work on another product that you might be familiar with. Does anybody have in their house or their dorm on-demand services from Comcast or a cable company? All right, are you familiar with video on demand? All right, that was my next business case. All right, I was still head of marketing and product development at that point in time, and we set about doing research on trying to get that cable box to do advanced functionality. And I brought with me today, and I'll show you a little peek, but we did a lot of quantitative research, but probably the most impactful and insightful was the qualitative research. And we did a laundry list of features and functionalities that we wanted that cable box to be able to do. Everything from email to digital video recording functionality to video on demand. And in order to understand that, and you guys can look at this too afterwards if you're interested. We literally sat with people and did one-on-one interviews, and we had an illustrator illustrate every single function that we could think of for this, what we called the advanced set-top box. So if you flip through here, you see some crazy ideas, and you'll actually see a glimmer of what the product is today. Some of this we actually couldn't pull off, and some of it we certainly did. From those one-on-one interviews, we were able to put together what are the most important features and functions. Each of the people we interviewed had this stack of functional ideas. And the first thing we asked them to do is, okay, you have this stack of stuff. We want you to go through it, and we want you to make two piles. One pile on things that you're interested in, and one pile of things that you're not interested in. Okay, and of the pile that you're interested in, put them in order of priority, and then let's talk about it. All right, it was those conversations and insights from real consumers, okay, that led us to the insights that we have today on the advanced set-top box. Okay, so the box today has digital cable features, video on demand, and that video on demand uses that two-way line that we developed for high-speed internet, and it's also got digital video recording functionality. The highest scoring feature on the research, and you can see the date of this. You can test my writing skills on my memorandum here. November 20th, 1998. The highest feature of all of the things, what would you guys guess it is? Of all the things we asked them about, what do you think people wanted the most? TV on demand. Actually, before it scored higher than movies on demand was TV on demand. And it was that insight that led us to do partnerships with TiVo and a company called Replay TV. All right, so I guess my little story is a roundabout way of talking to you about not only the importance of writing no matter what you're going to be doing, okay? And in business, we're all about trying to be objective but clear, concise, and I can't help but be passionate. So if you can put that combo together, believe me, people will listen to you. Okay? When I hired people though, and when I had employees that worked for me who had typos or poor grammar, all of a sudden I wasn't listening to anything they said. Nobody was. Okay? You're not very promotable in business if you can't communicate well. You can have all the greatest ideas in the world, but if you can't figure out a way to make people listen to you so they'll give you millions of dollars to develop products, it doesn't matter. Okay, and a lot of that has to do with writing and speaking. You know, another thing that was brought up, it had to do with kind of using qualitative research and understanding it. Now I'm in an academic space and I do a lot of research now. I definitely thought my business experience from the past would be a little bit more interesting for you since you might be familiar with those products. But as I get into the world of academic writing, it's yet another challenge for me. Right? And so what I would ask you to do is, if you weren't one of those people that raise your hand as a naturally gifted writer, okay, keep in mind two things. You will need to improve your writing to be successful. You just will need to. I had to, and I actually struggle and work on that every single day. Right? And it's actually kind of a nice journey because when you can do it well and people notice it, you recognize how far you have come. That's pretty much all I have.
courses on writing, including rhetoric and composition, research writing, technical and scientific writing, web authoring, internet communication, and business writing. Her research interests focus on the rhetoric of medicine. She's published on the impact of disciplinary knowledge on technological literacies and on research from activity perspectives. Please welcome Professor Nova.
Well, thank all of you for coming tonight. This is probably the most amount of students that we've had so far. And thank you to Professor Seta and Connolly for telling my students how important writing is. I think that we say that all the time, but it means a lot more when it's coming from other professors. I worked in business for a couple of years at Goldman Sachs, and I know that every single day I was there, I was writing memos, putting together reports. It was an everyday thing. What I'm going to talk about is my dissertation project, because that's the research project that I am the most familiar with. And when I started thinking about this talk, I started thinking about how long it takes to get a PhD. First off, it takes 2 years. It took me 2 years to get my master's degree. And then it took 5 years to put together, well, to finish my coursework for my dissertation and then to put together my actual research project. My research project, my dissertation ended up being about 200 pages long, so it's an enormous document if you guys aren't quite familiar with exactly what that looks like, and it focused on the rhetoric of medicine. It was entitled Rhetoric, Medicine, and the Impact of Technology on Subjects and Statements. And if I ever decide to make that into a book, I'll be sure to come up with a snazzier title. So anyway, after this 5-year process, after finishing and defending my dissertation, which happened in December of 2002, so not very long ago at all, you can see how it's difficult to remember how or why I was ever interested in this topic at all. So I was really starting to try to dig deep and remember why was I interested in the rhetoric of medicine. And I came up with a couple of things. First off, I remember one of my first encounters with a doctor, or first lengthy encounters with a doctor, was when I was 12 years old. And when I was 12, I started to get migraine headaches. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever had a migraine headache, but it is a specific kind of headache. It's particularly throbbing. And at the time, which this was about 20 years ago, they didn't have any really effective medication for migraine headaches. So I ended up having a choice of 2 options for how I might control these headaches. One was to take this pretty strong medication, and the other was to control my diet better, try to eliminate stress from my life, engage in exercise more frequently. So one, medication didn't require that much work on my part, and it was effective every time. And the other one, the exercise, changing your diet, all those sorts of things, took quite a bit of participation on my part. And also, I noticed when I was in my clinic, I had access to a pharmacy that was easily accessible for me. But I didn't have access to a gym membership. I didn't have access to a yoga studio. I didn't have access to a dietitian easily. So the actual institution was sort of inviting me to take care of my problem in a particular way. By the time I entered graduate school, I was already sort of moving down this road of thinking about the rhetoric of medicine or health and healing practices. And I had done some research projects while I was a master's candidate and also during my first 2 years of coursework, getting my PhD. And I actually remember talking with a surgeon who might have been the first, he was a guy that I was interviewing for a research project that I was undertaking. He might have really been sort of the first person that gave me the idea for my dissertation project. And he said he might have 2 people with the exact same problem with their spine. So he was a spinal surgeon. And they might have the exact same physical problem, but he might advise them differently based on, and he couldn't even really say exactly what the criteria was, but he might advise them differently based not on physical reasons, but rather these other things that he saw as really integral to the health and healing process. And when I started to really probe him and ask him what those things were, he came up with some answers that had to do with how much the candidate, potential surgery candidate, was willing to participate in their own health and healing process. And then, secondly, said it had something to do with the person's understanding of their own body. So how well could they tolerate pain? How easily would it be for them to work through the sort of rehabilitation process that was going to be really important after they got the spinal surgery? Okay, so I started to get really interested in what makes people sick. I thought it might be something more than just disease. It might be stress, and doctors agreed with this sort of thing. Also, what makes them better. It seemed to be more than just covering up the disease with medication. And then how much responsibility for healing was placed on the doctor and how much should be placed on the patient. Okay, so I had an idea. But the next thing I had to do in this research process is I had to figure out a site. So where was I going to go where these ideas rubbed up against each other? And I know you guys are working on qualitative research projects right now. That's one of the big obstacles that people run into when they're doing research projects. So if your professor doesn't give you a site to gather the data from, it's really hard to find a site to gather the data for whatever question you might think is interesting. In my case, I had a pretty lucky experience because at the University of Minnesota, there's a medical school, and there's also this other center, and it's called the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And this center had just gotten an enormous amount of funding, this huge NIH grant. And this Center for Spirituality and Healing had people who had MDs working in it. And those faculty members actually taught in the medical school. So I knew this was going to be a site where people were really started challenging the idea that disease was purely biological and really trying to integrate other ways of healing into medical practices. So I had a site. Then I had to determine specifically what I was going to look at. So I had an idea, but it didn't have to be specific to look at, and I don't have much of a dissertation project. So I noticed that new, more powerful technologies were being used at the medical school and were being developed by the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And these technologies were teaching students how to do lots of different things, how to engage in the interview process, how to remember lecture material. These technologies were actually also testing students. So I had read about how tools result from values, and tools also focus a person's attention on particular kinds of information. Only certain kinds of information is going to be communicated in a case study. Only certain kinds of information is going to be on a text. So that user, the student's attention is directed to particular kinds of information as a result of the tool that they're using. And I had read some stuff about how in the 19th century this sort of thing happened in medicine as a result of using tools. And the example that I always remembered the most was this example of the rise of the stethoscope. So before the stethoscope, the way that doctors would diagnose a patient was they would ask them what made them sick, right? Once the stethoscope was invented, the doctor didn't have to ask the patient anymore. He or she, and it was often mostly he, could tell certain things about the patient without them ever actually talking to the patient. The patient actually didn't even have to be conscious for a stethoscope to be able to work, right? So the result of that tool resulted in the shifting of a dependence on patient narrative to a dependence on a particular tool. I thought I could use this kind of research to ground the study that I was about to do. So teaching tools like lectures or case studies or tests put boundaries on what kind of information this medical student will see in the first place and how or if this information is used. All right, so I had a site and I had something specific to look at, and I had to come up with a method. So what was I actually going to do to gather my information? And I came up with a couple of ways to gather my information. One, I was going to interview faculty members from the Center for Spirituality and Healing, and I was also going to interview faculty members from the medical school. I also gathered some additional information that wasn't qualitative. So that was my qualitative component of the actual research project. I also looked at technology tools in the medical school and the Center for Spirituality and Healing, and I also looked at historical documents. So So I had everything sort of set up, and the first part of my project was really going and interviewing some of these people. So my first interviews didn't go so well. I went in and I had a very sort of targeted idea of what I wanted to extract from these interviews. And my questions were sort of overly targeted. So I was asking stuff like, do your teaching tools teach students to focus on using a linear scientific diagnostic process? Because what I wanted to really establish was sort of something that would verify what I was already suspecting was true. And the problem that people had, of course, with that sort of question is it's a yes-no question. People can't really interview even medical professionals, can't really expand or give you a really long, thought-out answer to that kind of question. And what I wanted was really a thick description of the culture of the medical school, the culture of the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And I wanted to try to identify how that culture was shaping particular kinds of tools that were directing users' attention, students' attention in particular ways. So I ended up really revising my interview questions. And I would simply ask people from the very beginning this one question, which was, will you please tell me about the teaching technologies you use and what you hope to accomplish with them? So it's a very broad, open question. I would have some follow-up questions prepared, and sometimes I use them, and sometimes I use half of them, and sometimes I use none of them. It really depended, but I sort of let the interviewee direct the way we went. All right, so what I found. This, of course, was a very long process, 3 years of my life, but what I ended up finding as a result of doing this sort of research was that there's lots of new teaching technologies that are being used, including electronic case studies, games, tests, and integrated into medical education. Interestingly, these technologies influence what students learn about medicine, so it is shaping particular kinds of positions in the medical school. But I also found that medical faculty and faculty from the center construct and integrate teaching tools differently in order to support their ideas about what is true about medicine. So more specifically, I found that there are two kinds of teaching tools, the kind from the medical school and the kind from the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And the ones that came from the medical school tended to support the following assumptions. First, that the physician controls the direction of the doctor-patient interview. And that this process is sort of hierarchical, and I think you guys have probably experienced that when you go to a doctor. Who is asking the questions generally? Is it you or the physician? Generally, the physician will ask the questions and guide the interview process. And secondly, that this diagnostic process is a linear process, and it's a scientific process, and it's really a biologically driven process. So in a sense, these tools really had the same values as the stethoscope. It's really working to locate, taught medical students to locate and find disease. Where is it? I also found that doctors weren't entirely satisfied with this kind of thinking. So faculty within the medical school, they knew that this was not really teaching students how to really figure out what made somebody sick. In part, they understood this because they were having trouble getting patients to comply with what they were telling them to do. So you might tell somebody they need to wait. That doesn't mean the patient's going to go home and do it. You might tell somebody to stop drinking. That doesn't mean that just because they know it's true or biologically right for them, that doesn't necessarily mean the patient's going to comply. So there's something else that motivates people to do what you say, and it isn't just because it's true scientifically. So although these tools involve deeply entrenched scientific professional ways of seeing, they didn't work to gain patient participation in their health. On the other hand, and this is the very last point that I'm going to make, the teaching technologies that were doing some of the things that doctors really wanted to teach students how to do didn't reside within the medical school. They actually resided over in the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And they were used in the medical school sometimes. The doctors weren't completely, the faculty in the medical school were
around for a 5 or 10 minute Q&A. Do people have questions about why or when to use qualitative research? Anything along these lines? We'll let this first group exodus. Questions?
Yeah, what is this about? But oh, I see the time though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's it. Bye.
Or is it the end of the class?